mencionado anteriormente, entiendo que en la charla última, que hay algunas personas que se benefician más que otras de la riqueza de la sociedad, ¿no? Entonces, ahora que tenemos que preguntarnos, ¿de dónde surgen las riquezas? ¿Cuáles son las fuentes de las riquezas?
We have mentioned above that there are some people who receive more benefit than others from society's wealth. Thus, we have to ask ourselves, where does the wealth come from? What are the sources of that wealth? It is usually said that a certain country is rich because it has natural wealth. For example, that Venezuela is rich because it has oil, that Chile is rich because it has copper, and that other countries are rich because they had uranium, and so on. Also, there are lands that produce higher yields than others. For example, Cuba can produce up to 3 harvests per year on some prairies. In other countries, there may be just a single crop per year. Also, there are seas with more fish and shellfish life than others. All these are natural wealth. But is that the only source of wealth? Marx says that there is another one, labor. Then there are 2 sources of wealth, nature and labor. Let's see now how fundamental labor in all this is. Think about what would happen if there were no people willing to work to put such nature wealth at the reach of the people. Without the labor of the workers, the oil reserve would be left underground. Without the labor of copper miners, the copper would also be of no use. The same goes for the mountain's water. If it weren't for workers who creates the condition to channel this water to hydroelectric dams, as the case of Chile or other countries, the water would run to the sea without being of any use for humanity. Without the work of the peasants, the land would not produce all it is capable of. And the same thing with fish. If no fishing takes place, they would be left in the ocean, swimming free around the world, all the fishes. We can thus see that it is labor that actually enables nature's richness to be effectively transformed into wealth that men and women can use. As I said, Marx speaks of these 2 sources of wealth, nature and labor, but it is often ignored, especially of course by capitalists, that human work is one of the sources of the wealth. Now, let's see in whose hands this wealth ends up. Does it end up in the hands of the workers? Not really. What we see in our countries is that the most of the wealth ends up in the hands of a small number of families. And when talking about countries, most times the wealth of less developed countries ends up in the hands of transnational corporations located in more developed countries. Let's now compare, for example, how much does a worker earns each year and how much a capitalist earns. The gap is enormous, isn't it? If we think that inequality in Latin America's countries were already very important when the Cuban Revolution triumphed, later, in the 80s and the 90s of the last century, this gap between the rich and the poor increased enormously. A small group enriched itself more and more, while poverty increased as well. This following data is significant. According to the World Bank, in 2010, the richest 10% of the people consumed 60% of the world's resources, and the poorest 40% only consume 5% of the reserves. In Chile, this situation of inequality that already existed in the 60s increased greatly with Pinochet's dictatorship. and it has continued to deepen today. A small group has enriched itself more and more. In Allende's time, we were one of the countries with the smallest gap between the rich and the poor. We had no gated houses. The rich, in spite of being rich, lived without having to feel ashamed of their wealth. They did not need to hide behind walls. When I returned to Chile after the dictatorship, I saw entire neighborhoods behind walls because, as a consequence of neoliberalism, the gap between the rich and the poor is now enormous. Data from the United Nations shows that Chile is among the 20 countries with greatest inequality in the world. An example of this inequality is the amount of bread that a rich family can consume compared with a poor family. With 10% of the wage received by a member of the wealthy family, one can buy 115 kilos of bread per month. And with 10% of the wage received by a member of a poor family, one can only buy 1.5 kilos. In Chile, the richest 1% earns 123 times more than the poorest 10%. That is, not only the wealth is poorly distributed, but there is also a great polarization or a big gap between the rich and the poor. This is something inherent to capitalism, and even more in neoliberal capitalism. As a result of this unequal distribution of wealth, the people who work in Latin America, for example, have to travel hanging from the bus, while in homes of rich people they have 3 or even 4 cars. While working people sometimes hardly have sufficient money to rent a small room or a small apartment, rich people have 3 or 4 houses in different parts of the country and sometimes also abroad. While many women and many families in the village have varied dress and a pair of nicer shoes for a special occasion, the wardrobes of the women from rich families are filled with dress and shoes, which they often use only once or twice a year. The children of the poor are often poorly fed, while the house of the rich food gets thrown away. While women of poor families often have to work double, work as laborer and work at home, cooking, caring of the children, washing clothes, and so on, rich women often do not work, and sometimes have 2 or 3 servants in their home. And if they work, at least they have somebody to do all the domestic tasks that the poor woman has to do herself. And so we can go on with huge contrasts. Now, why in a country a small group of families are able to concentrate so much wealth? Where is the origin of social inequality? Where is the origin of wealth? Ask rich people, and how do they respond? They say that people are poor because they are lazy, because they drink and intoxicate themselves, because they lack creativity and culture. And they think that the rich are rich because they strive and they are intelligent. That is to say, they attribute wealth to personal merit. To combat these arguments and get to the real answer as to why wealth ends up in the few hands and not in the workers' hands, we will start from our statement that labor is what allows nature's wealth to be accessible to humanity, and we will analyze in detail the labor process. Marx said that we had to distinguish between the work of human and that of spider, an insect or an animal. What is the difference between the work of an insect and a human labor? He said that while it is true that the bee, for example, builds cells and that sometimes it builds them much better than a human being, the human being when he builds already has in his head the project with which he is going to do the job, and the animal do not. Therefore, all human labor is a process to an end, and that purpose is to meet human needs. In the next lectures, we are going to study all the elements of the labor process.